Okay, I think it's my job in this is to kind of, given all of this, what's just happened to the stem cell policy and what's likely to happen going forward, kind of how much change has there really been. And there were a lot of expectations raised during the presidential campaign that an Obama administration would change federal stem cell policy fairly significantly. We've been working under a set of regulations that, as several people have said, were promulgated very early in the Bush administration that limited the stem cell lines that federal research funds could be used to support. And a lot of people were hoping that most if not all of those restrictions would go away. Now, President Obama has in fact promulgated an executive order, and NIH has issued a set of draft guidelines about what the federal government will fund. And I think what's noteworthy about them is that they were considerably less expansive than certainly a lot of people were hoping and that a lot of people were expecting. And here's what the executive order says. It's 13,505. I'm not sure when they started counting these things, how far back, when one was. But the important thing to note about this executive order is that it's relatively narrowly drawn. It's less than a page long, and it really says nothing except we repeal the Bush administration restrictions on stem cell funding, which were largely promulgated by executive order. And some were promulgated by something called a policy statement, which isn't even an executive order. But there were two main things that this executive order does. It simply says we're not limiting federal funding to specify these certain set of lines anymore. We're eliminating a prohibition on using federal funds to either directly or indirectly to support research on ineligible lines. And what this language had done had caused a lot of medical schools and other kinds of research facilities to get very nervous about using any of their equipment, any of their buildings, any of their people who were even remotely paid for by federal funds. Because if you were found to be illegal or to be illegally supporting ineligible lines, you could lose all your other federal money. So people were going out and buying all kinds of, constructing new buildings, buying new lab equipment, segregating graduate students, which is usually a good idea, but all this executive order does is says we're not doing that anymore in about so many words. And it doesn't promulgate any particular set of standards for what is going to be the administration's policy. It leaves that up to NIH. And NIH just a couple of weeks ago came out with a new set of draft guidelines. And what it does is expand the limits, but only in a relatively incremental fashion. During the Bush administration, Congress passed not once but twice a bill which would expand the lines that federal funds could be used to support. And the basic line they drew was around this created but not used for reproductive purposes standard. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. Congress passed this twice. The president vetoed it twice, and there weren't enough votes to override. So what NIH essentially does is take that piece of legislation and essentially say, here's what the regulations are now going to be. So in a lot of ways, they're still sticking fairly closely to established procedures. Donation with informed consent. You have to get somebody's explicit consent to donate their eggs, and you can't have any financial incentives associated with it. They're also explicitly compliant with what's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which is an amendment that's been attached to every HHS appropriations bill since 1996. It essentially says you can't use federal funds to create embryos for research. And it's fairly clear, the important thing is as much what's not there. There's no calls to repeal Dickey Wicker, the president's top domestic policy advisor has said explicitly the administration has no position on Dickey Wicker. There's no endorsement of therapeutic cloning. There's no explicit calls or promises of more federal money for embryonic stem cell research, and there's no calls for allowing federal funds to be used to pay for eggs. Now, if you're a political scientist, you like to speculate, and since I'm a political scientist, I'm going to speculate that what the administration was trying to do by this very low-key, very incremental approach was to do something that both lived up to their campaign promises of removing restrictions, but at the same time was as uncontroversial as possible. In fact, when the NIH director announced these guidelines, he was fairly explicit. One of the reasons why we're doing this and not going any further is because there's support for doing this, and a lot of these other things are still pretty controversial. And the reaction they got was, I think, the one they were looking for. A lot of stem cell advocates were disappointed that the administration didn't go further, but a lot of detractors who've been historically opposed, including L'Osservatoire Romano, which is the Vatican's sort of house organ, came down to the thing was, we don't like this, but it could have been a lot worse. So they didn't scream as loudly as they could have. And so the standard kind of editorial reaction to this is a pretty good way of kind of getting in the middle and not doing anything that's terribly controversial. And the question is sort of, is this it? Is this all we're going to see out of this administration in terms of expanding stem cell lines? And I think so. Because as we've heard, there are a lot of these issues around human embryonic stem cells that still remain pretty controversial. The guidelines that the NIH promulgated had essentially been passed twice before. They've gotten a political stamp of approval. These other things, there's no clear majority for them. We haven't had the kind of discussion and the sort of test votes, if you will, that we had on what NIH is proposing to do. And there are other issues that kind of are in this same general area that I think this administration sees as more important, particularly this abortion reduction initiative that's just been announced, whether or not the president should have been invited to speak at Notre Dame, and whether or not Kathleen Sebelius should be Secretary of HHS. So I think, given that all these other issues kind of activate that same set of cleavages and that same set of political actors, I think the administration is likely to conclude that we did what we said we're going to do and we don't really want to push this any further. That all the kind of signals that are getting sent here, including the fact that everything connected with this initiative was announced at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, which is the time of day and week when media attention is at its lowest, suggests that the administration really doesn't want to fight about this. And they think they've got something that both meets their campaign promise but doesn't activate any huge opposition. Now, the one exception to this might be money. NIH got $10 billion as part of the stimulus package. And while they're trying to spend that as fast as they can, but at some point, the NIH regulations, which are now drafted, are likely going to become final. And then my prediction is going to be the floodgates are going to open, and proposals are going to come pouring in from everywhere. That's $10 billion, even by NIH standards, is a lot of money. So it may be, in fact, that the federal government will wind up supporting more stem cell research than they have in a long time. But the question is kind of what happens next. Because in the absence of a strong federal funding and policymaking structure, states and private funders have kind of picked up the ball and spent money and made policy about stem cell research. And as Amy says, these policies have been all over the place. There's also been an unusual amount of private funding going into stem cell research. Some disease foundations, like the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, which is JDRF, Michael Fox's foundation, which funds research in Parkinson's disease, have spent money on stem cells. But what's really been big is big contributions by individual donors and foundations. These are people like Dolby of Dolby Sound, Mayor Bloomberg of New York, who's given close to $100 million just by himself. So these have been very big donations, and they've typically been aimed at building labs and facilities to avoid this sort of indirect and indirect kind of comparison. Well, so what we're going to wind up with, I would predict, is a continuation of the present system, in that we've got a lot of payers, a lot of sets of rules, and these problems that Amy was talking about conflict between all these rules, are going to have to be worked out. Now, there are ways and mechanisms to work these things out. Judy sits, for example, on an interstate group of stem cell agencies that tries to kind of stay out of each other's way. Is that a fair way to put it? But of trying to identify places where there are conflicts between one state's laws and rules and another, and how can we negotiate those things out. States and private funders continue to be major players. There's a lot of competition between states for this kind of stuff, and there's some evidence that, in fact, state efforts to make themselves visible and make themselves known as a centerpiece of stem cell research actually work. So you can expect states to keep doing it. Now, the problem is going to be, is there going to be as much money because of the various economic troubles? States are having budget troubles, portfolio foundations are having shrinking portfolios. So there may be, in fact, a bit less money from the states and private foundations, a little bit more money from NIH. But in terms of putting the states out of business, or sort of putting the feds into the picture, back into the picture in a major way, I don't think that's going to happen. What may well happen, though, is something that's beginning to get visible in California and a couple of other states, is that states are going to change what they pay for. What states want out of this ultimately is, products that they can take credit for, jobs, and those haven't shown up yet. They want basically a short-term payoff. So California, that spent several $100 million on basic stem cell science, is coming under pressure, is I think in the process of awarding a very large round of grants that says we want to be in clinical trials in 4 years. Now that's very short. That's a very short-term perspective that says we're not doing basic research anymore. We want results quickly. And a couple of other states are in that same kind of shift. A lot of foundations that have traditionally supported research into other diseases are shifting toward this, we're tired of waiting around for miracles, we want results now. And while I haven't seen any stem cell foundations doing that yet, my guess is that's going to come. Because people want results, they don't want to wait around, they don't want to keep on paying scientists to do stuff that they don't understand without something to show for it. So that's the end of that. You can follow me.